Hey guys, it's GirlGotGame, and these are my final thoughts on Saint Maker, the latest horror visual novel from Yang Yang Mobile. Please keep in mind that there will be some story spoilers discussed, so if you're worried about spoilers, I'd highly encourage you to either play the game yourself or watch either myself or someone else play through it first before watching this. But with that being said, let's jump in. So, as I mentioned, this is the latest game from Yang Yang Mobile. I had previously finished their first game not too long ago, The Letter, which was also a horror visual novel. I will say right off the bat, if you're going into Saint Maker expecting the same kind of experience you got in The Letter, then you may be disappointed. That's not to say Saint Maker isn't a high quality visual novel that's enjoyable in its own right, but it's very different from The Letter. For example, this game is much shorter. The letter had multiple chapters from 7 different character point of views with multiple, and I do mean multiple, butterfly effect branching trees that gave you several different endings. By contrast, Saintmaker is almost a kinetic visual novel in a lot of senses. That's not to say there aren't choices involved and that those choices don't impact some of the game, but for the most part, it is a linear story going towards one ending. Your choices really only affect some small lines of dialogue in a scene, and whether you built a close enough relationship with Gabby to get a special little bonus scene between her and Holly after the main ending of the game. Another note regarding choices is that sometimes the characters, in particular Holly, will actively fight against the choice you've picked and do the other option. This could be frustrating for some players who might wonder why even bother having choices to begin with, and I'll admit to having felt some frustration there myself from time to time. There does come a point in the story where the game does tell you very point blank that it was never really your choice to begin with, which was a pretty awesome moment, I must admit. I do kind of wish that after that point no more choices were given to you though. I think it would have been neat to give an illusion of choice early on, have the bombshell moment, and then the game just tells the story it wants to tell. That being said, I do understand what they were going for with the choice system. As you make choices, there will be moments where the font or color of the text will change in those choice boxes, making it obvious it's not the characters making these choices or thinking those thoughts, but rather some outside haunting force, and those choices are the game's way of showing the struggle between the characters and that force. It is kind of fun to put the player in that position, as you have to make some pretty messed up dialogue choices sometimes to taunt and manipulate the characters. And I can also understand why they went with choices instead of whispered words in the characters' heads like they did in the letter. With no voice acting for the choices, you're left to theorize on who exactly is talking to the characters when. Is it Holly? Adira? Cornelia? Or Mother Idalora? All in all, I wasn't too bothered by how choices were implemented here, but I could see it being an aggravation for some who may be expecting their choices to affect a lot, especially if they played the letter and were used to its many branching paths. Something else that differentiates this game from the letter is that there are a lot less characters, and it's a much shorter story, which has both its good points and its bad. What's great about this is that there were no sections where I felt the game was dragging on too long. I thought the pace throughout the game was excellent, and I was constantly engaged. The letter had a big problem with that, where there'd be long periods of poetic musings going on in a character's head before the game would progress, and that was not a problem here at all. I also felt like the overall story was very coherent and not disjointed. The only real negative thing I have to say about having less characters is that I missed the nuanced point of view of what was happening from different characters. While we do get points of view from Adira from time to time, Holly is very much the main character. I'm also unsure why we didn't get some segments from Gabby's perspective. I mean, the reason could be because they were really trying to highlight the parallels between Holly and Adira, but considering how small the group of main characters was, and how small the segments with Adira were already anyway, I really would have loved to have had Gabby's thoughts and perspective on some of the things that were going on. But other than that, the story itself was very well written. I was thoroughly engaged the entire time trying to piece together and theorize what exactly was happening in this creepy convent, as well as trying to figure out the timeline of events and whether things we were seeing were actually happening or were just dreams. And as for the horror, I definitely say this is a distinctly different cup of tea than the horror that was in the letter. This game definitely nailed the creepy and spooky factor. The setting of a creepy convent with moving, deteriorating statues and a faceless girl definitely were scary. But there were very few jump scares, which I personally appreciated, but it definitely sets it apart from its predecessor. No more heart-pounding QTEs, and there wasn't really a moment where I felt like me or the character was in danger. I guess the best way to describe it is by saying it's not a traditional horror game. It really is more about exploring horrific themes that have a basis in reality, but of course with a touch of the supernatural happening as well. I also would say that this game will be more disturbing and upsetting depending on the person playing it. I'd imagine if you grew up in a deeply religious family with strict rules, this game could potentially bring up lots of unpleasant feelings and memories, and that the themes discussed through the story and the character of Holly would resonate more deeply because of that. I will say that, thankfully, I personally didn't grow up in that kind of environment, but I have had friends that have described some similar experiences to what Holly and her sister grew up in, so I know that this has a basis in reality, and I thought it was portrayed very well, and you can't help but feel for these poor girls. Because of that, I think it's very easy for the player to want to play into Holly's fantasy of reaching out to help her sister, because that's naturally what we would want to do too. The truth, when it does come out, is so gut-wrenching, and I'll admit I was holding back tears reading through when Holly stopped fantasizing and faced her real memories. The story definitely made me tear up several times. The reveal of Cornelia and her relation to Adira was not something I was expecting. I thought Cornelia and Adira's story was written exceptionally well. That was one of the toughest parts to read through in the entire game, and I have to give this game kudos for how quickly I went from being scared of this faceless girl to being almost unbothered by it and wanting to comfort her so badly. The only character I didn't feel as drawn to was Gabby, and that's probably in large part because we don't get to play from her perspective at any point, and she really has a lot less screen time than Holly and Adira do. We do get some small background story from her regarding her dad's death, how her mom and her were not religious until recently, and why she was sent to this convent for the summer. And I did feel bad for her, but nowhere near the extent I did for Adira and Holly. Regardless, I was glad to have her in this story as someone who called out the ghost shenanigans very early on, and was the only sensible one urging for them to leave the place as soon as possible. She was also a great companion for Holly, and really kickstarted her journey towards accepting the death of her sister and starting to move forward. And at the end of the day, the story really is about highlighting the parallels between Holly with Liana and Adira with Cornelia, which is why the story focuses so heavily on them. I thought they did a fantastic job gradually showcasing that, and I never felt like it was over the top. It was all done in a way that became obvious when you stopped to think about it and wasn't shoved in your face. But as always, I would have loved to get more concrete answers at the end. For instance, if the convent that the girls were sent to belongs to a sect, does that mean Holly's parents and Gabby's mom are part of it too? Is that why they were sent there? Does that mean they're like in a lot of trouble when they go back home to visit Gabby's mom? I'm a little worried for those girls, not gonna lie. I'm also so curious what was going on at the convent. Was Mother Idalora actually the big bad ghost haunting it? Was it some other kind of entity that just took on the face of Idalora and the other nuns? Or was it a ghost of the past / stuck in purgatory situation? And I also would have liked some kind of epilogue or something about Adira and what she ended up deciding to do. That is most likely just a personal gripe of mine though, since I like to have things tied off with a bow as much as possible instead of leaving things open. In conclusion though, it might not have pulled me in as much as the letter did with its story, but I still really enjoyed what was told here, and I'm glad it ended on a hopeful note. And then, of course, I'd be absolutely remiss if I didn't mention the music, SFX, and voice acting. The music was absolutely fantastic. Each piece was an absolute delight to listen to and always perfectly fit the mood of whatever scene was happening. They definitely knocked it out of the park once again in the music department. And the sound effects were definitely super spooky and very fitting. I can't recall any sound effects that I thought were odd or didn't fit. The only negative thing I have to say about them is I wish I could have turned them down. I assume it must have been some kind of bug, but no matter how much I fiddled with the audio slider for that, I could not make it quieter, and the statue slam sound effect was particularly loud. I was a very big fan of the window knocking sound effect, though. That sounded a little too realistic, and there was more than one occasion where I swore it was coming from the window in my office. And as for the voice acting, the VAs absolutely knocked it out of the park. They all really put their everything into those lines. Adira and Holly's VAs in particular are standouts in that department. The screaming and crying from both of them sounded so realistic and unsettling on many occasions, and I cannot praise the VA work from everyone in this enough. Absolutely phenomenal job. And finally, I wanted to comment on the art. It's stunning. It's very similar to the style from the letter, with its beautiful backgrounds and how everything feels very alive, with movement of dust particles, sunlight streaming in and out, and birds flying by windows. The birds are still flying by a little too often for me. But otherwise, most of that was done well and was very pretty to look at. There's plenty of item sprites too to give you some up-close and personal looks at some of these broken statues if you weren't unsettled enough by them from far away already. But in all seriousness though, I thought they were used well, especially the secret box changing what items were inside, and Cornelia's journal. There were tons of CGs too, especially towards the end game, and I thought they were all wonderful. My favorite is probably the one of Holly and Gabby holding hands at the end of the game. It really gives off a magical air. And if I had to pick a favorite spooky one, it would be the one with all the statues around Italora. The way they turn towards you and glitch out is very unsettling. The character sprites were also well done, and just like in the letter, there were so many variations of poses, expressions, and movement, with hair moving, as well as blinking eyes and mouths moving during dialogue. I will say I was a little confused that not all the characters had their mouths move during dialogue. Italora and the nuns, for instance, never do. Regardless, it's a beautiful game to look at that does a wonderful job at capturing both the scary moments as well as the more intimate moments. So, with all that being said, while my time with the game ended up being shorter than I expected, I really enjoyed playing through it. I don't think I can say it surpassed the letter for me, and once again, if you come into this expecting that huge game with lots of endings, characters, romance, in-your-face spooks, then you may be disappointed. But if you're looking for a very high-quality visual novel with a great story that has a horror twist to it, then I would definitely recommend it. All those things work great for this kind of story that they told, and I'm definitely a huge Yang Yang fan, and I look forward to whatever their next project may end up being. Now, with that being all said, it's time to announce the next game for our Sunday slot. I'm really spoiled for choice at the moment, so it was hard to decide, but since it's spooky month, I thought it would only be appropriate to keep the horror train going a little longer, so I'm going to be playing the elevator game with cat girls from No Bread Studio that I did a gander on ages ago. I've been itching to finish that point-and-click visual novel, and I think now's the perfect time for it. Hopefully I'll see you over there for that. But regardless, thank you for listening to my final thoughts. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this game as well if you'd like to comment down below. Thanks again for watching, and as always, until next time, I will see you later.